Thanks all for coming. I expect more and more folks will come since I know the last session ended a little late. We're really excited to have you here. I'm going to have a great conversation with some phenomenal panelists. I'm really excited to introduce Liz Dozier, who's a founder of Chicago Beyond and a former principal, who's an amazing person in her own right, spotlighted in a CNN series I just heard about. So I'm excited that you all can hear from her and her fellow panelists. Please welcome Liz to the stage.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, there you are. So we have an exciting hour or so ahead of us. Before we get started with our actual panel, I wanted to take a second to just acknowledge our commitment makers. And I have a couple people that I'd like to invite to the stage. And I want to tell you a little bit about their work. So we're going to start with Catherine Strauss. So if you could come on up. So Catherine is from the University of California, Berkeley, and I want to tell you what her challenge was and then how she's addressing it. So we all know that people in the juvenile justice system have poor prospects of obtaining a high school diploma and also entering higher education. And we know that youth recidivism is higher than that of adults, and education while in prison is substandard. And so here's how they're addressing this particular program. The Juvenile Education Project will design and distribute college application guidebooks tailored to teens in juvenile halls. The guidebooks that they've designed will include information about colleges, waive application fees, accept students with high school equivalency degrees and no SAT scores, and have programs for formerly incarcerated students. And there'll be other information throughout this guidebook in terms of like financial aid application, essay writing, and information about expunging prison records. And this is so absolutely critical because we know that the success of our young people is often, and if not 100%, determined by their education and access to educational opportunities. So let's give her a big congratulations with a round of applause. We're going to take our picture. Okay. Up next, we have two people, if you would join me on stage. This is Ifani Chinadozi and Tara Amadi. Welcome to the stage. So here's the challenge, and I'll give you a little bit about what they've been up to. So the prison population in the United States has quadrupled in the past 25 years, and inmates often do not receive adequate health care for medical and psychiatric conditions during incarceration. We also know that poor health, drug addiction, joblessness, and homelessness, all of those things present barriers to reentry in society, and that recidivism rate for adults is 78% within the first 5 years of release. So here's what they're up to. They came up with Incarcerated, a focus on rehabilitation. And what it does is it seeks to expand the work of the Phoenix Project, which is a 2-year education program to help inmates at a correctional facility to reengage and reintegrate in society and lead healthier lives. Incarcerated will hold weekly workshops with prisoners regarding crime risk factors, health risk factors, drug abuse, stress reduction, career skills, and homelessness avoidance. And it will also include an interdisciplinary collaboration among psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health providers, nutritionists, and physical activity experts. Let's give them a round of applause. All right, so we're going to be tight on time, so I want to make the best use of our time. So I'd like to welcome our panelists to the stage. If the four of you want to just join us on stage. saw you. Come on down, Kurt.
Curtis,
Don't be
you're the
shy.
youngest. You have the middle.
Right in the middle. So we're here to talk about addressing youth incarceration. And honestly, we could spend the next 8 hours, if not 8 weeks, really digging into this and understanding every single nuance that goes into this. But what we want to do today is really focus on a couple key issues, which I'll describe in a second. If you want to know their bios, they are the who's who of Whoville, if you will, in terms of really understanding this issue. Please check those out on the app. I'm going to give you a couple quick facts. First, there are over 47,000 young people that are incarcerated in any given day here in the United States. And that is astounding when you think about pure numbers of not just young people, but also families impacted. That's more people than can fit into the United Center, if you're from Chicago, more than 2 times that can fit into the United Center. We know that over 70% of those young people that are incarcerated are actually incarcerated for non-violent offenses, and over 70% of them are young people of color. Although we know that the number of incarcerated youth has decreased in the last, I would say, 17 years or so, we know that there are some things that are going up, and we know that's in regards to racial disparities, because we know that 5 times, if you're a person of color or a young person of color specifically, that you are 5 times more likely to wind up as a youth incarcerated than your white counterparts, and that we know that our LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in the system as well. Actually, 1 in 5 that are detained are LGBTQ, and when we compare that to the population, that's only between 7 to 9% of the population. So overall, we know that there are a lot of problems and issues, and that the over-reliance of incarceration ultimately impacts young people's life outcomes in terms of just civic engagement, education, all those things that would allow one to be prosperous in life. So, with that being said, I am going to ask Adam, and I think this is it's a great question to really ground us, especially being here in Chicago, where the first juvenile court was set up in 1899. How the heck did we get from there in 1899 to where we are actually today, to some of those stats?
Sure, and thank you for CGIU for taking on this topic that's left out of the conversation all too often. So from 1899 through most of the 20th century, things were okay. We recognized that kids were different. That's why we started the juvenile court. And then a few things started happening sort of like congruently with the bigger institution of mass incarceration in this country, the civil rights movement, coming out of the civil rights movement, leading into the war on drugs. And then in the 90s, really, between the super predator era and the mass shooting at Columbine High School, those 2 things came together to see this gigantic burst in the population of juvenile incarceration. The super predator era, of course, was about being this idea that there was just this whole host of young people out there that were going to be murderous, ravenous killers in the streets if we didn't do something about them, and so we started incarcerating them. And then Columbine happened, and as a result of Columbine, we instituted school discipline policies to prevent mass shootings, but somehow it criminalized normative teenage behavior, and that saw the dramatic increase in the populations in those places. In the following decades, we started to decarcerate, and we've done a very good job as a country decarcerating as a country, not as against the entire world, because we are one of the only countries that does this. But as you brought up, as we decarcerated, you saw disparities going wildly out of control, racial disparities, the way that we treat LGBTQ youth, girls in the system. And so while our juvenile justice system is, in terms of sheer numbers and volume, doing better than it ever has been in the number of young people that we have locked up, we are targeting the most vulnerable youth and incarcerating them, as opposed to treating the issues which bring them a lot into our system. Sprinkle in a little racism and misogyny in there, and you've got yourself like a very complex, intractable problem, which is why I'm so excited to see who's in this room, because we need you all to like think broader about how to resolve these issues than locking people up.
Jens, can you just add on to that when you think about research and you think about what Adam said? Like, can you just like describe maybe some of the needs of the young people that are in the juvenile justice system? What do we know about those?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is most striking about the juvenile justice system, it's kind of like the most extreme version of a general problem that we have in the United States. I mean, among the many problems that are the extreme versions in the juvenile justice system is the way that the country does a terrible job of dealing with mental health in general. So if you look at national data, something like 20% of all adolescents in America have some sort of diagnosable mental health problem. So this is among all teens in the US, which is remarkable. If you go to a place like the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, it's more like 60 or 70%. And substance abuse is the most common mental health problem. 50, 60% have some sort of substance use problem, but 15 to 20% have an anxiety disorder, similar shares for ADHD, for clinical depression, for bipolar disorder. So lots and lots of mental health problems in the system. As I was thinking about this as sort of a key challenge in the juvenile justice system, I was trying to think about what would be a constructive thing to say to a group of really smart, energized young people. And I wanted to just take 1 minute to talk about a good news story in Chicago that then turned into a disappointing news story in Chicago, but then leaves you guys with something to do after this, which is, so the juvenile detention center in Chicago has been a terrible place for a long, long time. And eventually, maybe 10 years ago, the ACLU finally won a lawsuit that got a federal judge to take over the facility. And they hired a guy from Michigan or wherever he's from to come in and take over the facilities on the west side of the Chicago on Roosevelt Road to implement a bunch of reforms. And so, untreated mental health problems was at the top of his list. He looks around and he says, I've got absolutely no money to do anything, and I've got a bunch of kids with these really terrible mental health problems, and I want to do something about it. And so he's trying to think pragmatically about what he can do when he realizes that, the kids, they go to the Nancy B. Jefferson School in the morning, they spend all afternoon watching TV in the common room, and the detention staff just sit there watching them. And he says, I've got an idea. Rather than have the kids just watch TV every afternoon, why don't we train the staff to provide mental health treatment to the kids? So it's a version of cognitive behavioral therapy where this is not like Freudian psychoanalysis. This is insanely pragmatic, like you have a kid who thinks like no one's gonna like me unless I show up high or drunk. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, has the flavor of, how do you know? Why don't you try and go to a party not drunk or high and see what happens? So challenge these sorts of maladaptive beliefs and test them to see if they're right or wrong. So you look at this and you think, this seems like an insane idea. On its face, it's like detention staff as mental health providers. But the research center I run at the University of Chicago, we partnered with the detention center to actually measure outcomes for the kids who get this sort of treatment, and you can see that their recidivism rates are 20% lower as a result of this. Now, 20% is not 100% lower, but you've got the building, you've got the kids, they're just watching TV. This is basically a free way to reduce recidivism rates by 20% times the hundreds or thousands of kids who go through the facility. This seems like an easy win, right? So that's the good news. The bad news is that eventually the leadership changed inside the detention facility, and the new leadership, together with the union who represents the detention staff, said, enough of this, and they stopped doing it. And so, one thing that I think would be super helpful there's no reason that every detention facility in the country should not be doing this, right? We should be doing this instead of having kids watch TV. If we can't do that, what can we do inside the juvenile justice system? And I think the only way that these systems are going to do constructive, easy things like this, to the extent to which there's low-hanging fruit like this, is if people pressure them. And that would be close to the top of my list for like things that we could do tomorrow to start making at least some incremental difference.
And then just give a little, just double click on that. So what is that? This is an active audience. This is an engaged audience. So when you say pressure them, like what does that translate to in real life? Like what does that look like?
I think people on the panel have a much better, I will defer to the other panelists about what that looks like in real life.
Well, I have something. So who in here, who votes? Who can vote? Who pays taxes? So your tax money is what's keeping people incarcerated and keeping those people actually employed. So I think where our tax dollars go, whether it's a juvenile facility or whether it's a prison system too, what's actually being done with our tax dollars inside the prison that's going to make change when people come home to reduce recidivism. So I think that's a voice that needs to absolutely rise up.
And then there's also, Kim, I'd love to hear more about like the project, the IF project that you're working on, because I think it is as much about what's happening in the detention centers as it is about what happens before young people reach that point. And so you've really taken that head on. And so if you want to talk a little bit about that, I think that would be great for the audience to hear. Great.
So the IF project started 10 years ago, and it was asked of a group of women in a correction facility in Washington State, our max prison. And the question was, if there was something somebody could have said or done to change the path that led you to prison, what would it have been? So we've asked women, men, and juveniles that question, because me, I'm a 30-year police officer, so unbelievably tired of arresting people. Haven't put anybody in handcuffs in 10 years, and I'm actually pretty proud of that. And when I sunset in my career, the frustration I have is people that are getting caught up in the system for that one mistake they made. I had a 15-year-old first offense say, I wish somebody would have told me 10 seconds would cost me 10 years. Well, that's ridiculous that 10 seconds costs somebody 10 years. So the question is what even led to the act of the crime way back here that we need to start looking at putting in programming, intervention, preventions that start way before police have to come in and put handcuffs on and then perpetuate the gerbil wheel of flushing people in, and then 95% of people are coming home, and we're stuck in this thing. How do we interrupt the trajectory at the beginning? And the other thing we found fascinating with the IF project is when you had people that had been system impacted, formerly incarcerated, I feel like the word changes every day on how we address people that have been impacted by the system. When they get up and they actually share their story of maybe that early childhood trauma or something that happened that led them to incarceration, it puts a human face back on a person that's been in the system, as opposed to what TV, media, the newspaper, everything says about somebody that's been. We always hear about the worst case scenario. We don't hear about the person that makes that decision that leads them to incarceration. And I don't think anybody in this room, who in this room would like to be judged on the worst thing you ever did in your life? I would surely not like to be that person. So how do we, with sharing of the stories, start to get people to have some common thread, like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize we actually had the same issue happen, or we believe the same way, as opposed to they've been in the system, they're a felon, they're a juvenile issue. They're human beings that we need to understand a lot more. So what we try to do is figure out how to amplify creating that common conversation and those common threads that we all have as human beings to figure out how to make change. And the other thing is super important, that they're always at the table when you're deciding to do the work. Because I can't speak for somebody that's been in a prison cell or been in a set of handcuffs. I can speak for people that have done that, but in order to change, you have to go to, I'm a police officer working with people to try to figure out how to keep them out of prison or jail or juvenile detention. So I guess my call to action to you is the work that you want to do. What's your most unlikely ally that may want the same thing as you, or that you haven't thought of, would have some really great ideas on how you could get your work done? That's where you actually go make change, because you start building a highway with a lot of lanes, not a one-lane road getting to the city to make the change. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
Kurt, that's where I feel like you spent the last big chunk of your life, really is at the forefront of what Kim is saying, working directly with young people, trying to prevent that point of juvenile incarceration or juvenile probation, or even touching the juvenile justice system. So if you want to walk us through that, and then also to talk about, like, what do you see that's really working there, or any messages that you have really from the field of this work?
I didn't know you were going to really ask me a question. So I have a full disclaimer, right? I don't really believe that I was on the panel at first because I'm really not that smart. I'm really like a hype man, and so someone else decided not to show up. So I'm like a glorified seat filler. So
Not true.
I'm glad that I'm surrounded by a bunch of smart folks because I'm just going to be nodding my head and agreeing. So that way you might think I'm smart as well. I think a lot of good points were already touched on, and I think one of the points that I would like to elaborate on a little bit is like the mental health part that seems like it's being ignored, right? And so mental health has a vast plethora, right? So when I think about mental health, I also think about trauma, right? And I have to immediately think about myself and the trauma that I experienced as a youth when I was first in the juvenile system, right? So at 17, my mom was killed and I found her dead in a garage, right? And no social worker, counselor, or clinician showed up at my door to address the issues that were going on in my mind. So shortly thereafter, I ended up in Stateville Penitentiary as, I think I was the 4th youngest inmate at the time. I spent my 18th birthday there, and I had heard so many alarming stories, and I also got the chance to be next door to a guy who, I don't want to tell my age, who some of you are probably familiar with that heard of, who went by the name of Richard Speck, right? So ending up in the cell next to Richard Speck on my 18th birthday was something, right? And I always think back, what if someone had just shown up at my door when my mom was killed? What would have been the trajectory of my life if that had happened, right? And so when I'm working with these young folks on a daily basis, not only here in Chicago, but I can speak more on Chicago because that's where I'm based, but throughout the country, it always comes back to the same thing, right? Wherever you have dysfunctional school systems, the lack of resources and employment, you always have a lot of violence, right? And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that and understand that. Until we really start addressing those issues on the front end, then we're going to continue to have this high rate of recidivism, if that makes sense.
So what do we do? I'll just throw this out to the panel. Like I think each of you are have an interesting perspective from your vantage point, from your work. And so there's obviously the emphasis that needs to be put on mental health, whether it's in our schools or communities. There's like this connective tissue being built amongst community between police. And there's the work that you're doing, Kurt, the work that you're doing as we think about the justice system, like where do we go? What should be priority? It's a huge, monstrous, and mammoth problem. Where do we begin to attack and focus our energy?
I mean, you know, it's always, I love this question because it's like, what do we do? And it's like, look at the community where this doesn't happen. Like, there are communities where young people aren't shooting each other all the time or getting arrested for acting a fool. I grew up in one of those communities, and it's like, oh yeah, no, we just, like, resources went to things like early childhood education and nutrition, and when kids were acting up, we asked them questions instead of punishing them, and like, the model is out there. This isn't, to your point, this isn't rocket science. What we need to understand and unpack is like, the people who continue to fill these roles, public school teachers, police officers, prosecutors, we continue to have the same education, and we're given the same tools to do our job, even though that the field of understanding young people is either like telling us to stop doing those things, or is responding in lots of different ways to adverse childhood experiences and trauma and understanding those things. Like, we don't learn those things when we go out on the job. And so there I am as a prosecutor who works exclusively with young people, and I don't know anything about trauma. I don't know anything about adverse childhood experiences. I don't know that just the way that I'm interacting with you in a courthouse is counterproductive to the thing that I want the most. So I think we spend a lot of times like, how do we fix these kids? And we never ask ourselves, like, are the people that are in these kids' lives even equipped to be doing the things that we are signing up to do? Because it's not a coincidence that the schools are failing them, the justice system is failing them, the police are failing them. Like, it's not a coincidence that we're all failing the same group of kids. The positive aspect of that is, like, we also, like, I didn't go to my job as a prosecutor saying, you know what, I like really love mass incarceration. Like, I want to look back at the end of the day and be like, I contributed to mass incarceration. I really love destroying families. I really love, like, seeing 15-year-old kids in handcuffs. I really love talking about, like, young people murdering each other. Like, I didn't go to this job for that. I went in because I had a core value of wanting to do good. Police go into the job because they have a core value of wanting to do good. Teachers go into this job having a core value of wanting to do good, but we're not equipped with the tools to do that because we're still stuck in 1899. So for me, it's just like, stop talking about the kids, fixing the kids. We need to fix ourselves, and we need to step our game up because like it happens for other young people, and we owe it to them to respond to the harm that's been done to them, be accountable for our creation of that harm, and fix ourselves, teach ourselves how to fix those problems.
Can I add something to this? Is thinking about the need to step up our game. So like you look at the public school systems in a lot of big cities in the United States right now, and you feel like, how can we let these school systems persist like this in the current condition? And it's, if anything, even worse than you appreciate, because the economy is changing so much in the United States, but not just the United States. So 50 years ago, if you made it through high school and got a diploma, you would get one of the tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs on the south or west sides of Chicago, and you could lead a perfectly fine middle-class life. If you drive around the south and west sides of Chicago, what you will see now is a bunch of shuttered up factories. And you know, the path to a middle-class life now, it does not, a high school diploma does not get you there. A high school diploma is just the thing that lets you take the next step that gets you there. And so it's like the stagnation with the public school systems is I think one of the scariest things about this, because it is sitting there in a world in which the economy and what you need to get a decent job is just changing year after year after year. And so the degree to which we're falling behind what we need to be doing is just getting at really distressing levels, I think.
Yep, for sure.
And I think the overarching thing too, is the number one indicator for incarceration is poverty. So I think it kind of goes back to what you were talking about, is we don't really have conversations. I mean, everybody in here wants to do that work, but if you grow up in a neighborhood where you're not faced with like not having food, not getting an education, so thank you for the work that you're doing with within the systems to try to figure out how to get higher education, get health care, deal with all those things, whether they're incarcerated or not. Those are indicators that will lead to potentially incarceration. But also when you're talking about socioeconomic issues like you were discussing, now it is maybe a 2-year degree or something like that where you can actually get a job that is a sustainable, livable wage job. And anybody in here, I don't think people get up in the morning and go, I'm a juvenile, I'm not gonna go to school, I'm gonna get arrested, or I'm gonna end up in a situation. But if you gotta figure out how to eat, and you gotta figure out how to survive, anybody in here, I would do it. I would do what it took to take care of my family. And that's an unfortunate thing when the resources aren't there in certain neighborhoods, like legitimately there. And you have a lot of things, I think, that pop up around the country that are small grassroots organizations wanting to do well that don't end up getting supported for sustainability that are within those communities. So I think supporting those and taking a look at going into communities that have more free and reduced lunch, those kinds of situations to make the change from that place in, but bring them with you to do the work.
What I see in this room, what makes me really hopeful, is something that I run into all the time. I talk about this stuff all the time, and typically it's in rooms of really, really wealthy people, and they always come back with like, yeah, well, what if they just like tried harder? Or, this is America, like you can do anything you put your mind to, an opportunity, you put yourself up by the bootstraps. I hope that we can have like open and honest conversations about privilege. Like, I hope that we recognize in this room that we didn't get here because we just worked hard enough and harder than the young kids who are locked up. And so even if it's just like working together to change conversation around these things and understanding that like poverty is not the lack of wealth, that it's not the lack of trying hard and getting out of that it's about structures that have been put in place, and talking about breaking down those structures so that people can enjoy the fruits of things. Like there's this reticence to subsidize things for people like housing. If we subsidized housing for people, they're trying this out in New Orleans. In New Orleans, they literally want to give housing to every housing insecure person, whether they're homeless or insecure, couch surfing. They want to give housing to people because the people down there, the young people down there, have recognized like, if we give people housing, we all benefit from that. And recognize that like none of this is charity because we're already paying for it in major fundamental ways. We're already paying for poverty out of our own pockets. If we subsidize people's education, if we subsidize things like breakfast, if we subsidize things like early childhood education and housing and healthcare, the dividends that return to us are not just that good feeling that we've been charitable, altruistic people. It means that our economy is better because there's more participation in it. The cost associated with housing insecurity and long-term poor health outcomes in the criminal justice system go away. That all comes back to us, and that benefits us. So I hope that like the folks in this room, because you are who you are, can have a more evolved conversation about these ideas than the people that I'm around who are just like, no, I'm wealthy because I worked hard, and I'm not going to give any of this stuff away.
That's such a good point. It's often one times the most frustrating things that I come across is when people feel like they've just arrived just because that's, you know, what everyone has access to, and it's just so not true. It's really a matter of the justice issues here in our country, overall justice. I'd like to talk a little bit about like how can we make the actual system more helpful, or if nothing else, just less harmful than what it already is, as we think about obviously the broader things about how we got here in terms of disinvestment in communities and education, all those things that surround the system that make it so. Like in this immediate term, what can we do? And this is for really anyone on the panel. What can we do to make it either more less harmful or more helpful?
Stop delineating between violent and nonviolent crime. And looking at, you know, like, it's very easy for us to talk about fixing the criminal justice system when we talk about low-level nonviolent. As soon as we get to violent, the conversation ends, and that's where people, again, it's like that, well, I never would have done that. And so I don't feel, what I feel for these people is different than what I feel for those. Because, and Curtis, like, I'd love to hear your input on this piece, because it's like, violence is not just like the individual manifestation of bad behavior and bad decision making. It is the reaction and response, the manifestation of harm that's been done to me. And so there's like key indicators of what is going to make someone act violently. It's like isolation, shame, the inability to meet basic needs, and unresolved trauma. And then you think about like the vehicle, the tool that we've been giving to teach people not to do that, incarceration. And what are the 4 functions of incarceration? Isolation, shame, depriving somebody's ability to meet basic needs, and putting people together that have a bunch of unresolved trauma. And so like the fact that someone then comes out and is violent again, we as a system are so arrogant that we're like, that's their fault. And we don't take the time to look at the tool that we've been given and think, maybe there's something different to do here. And maybe we should start talking about violence as a contagious disease, as opposed, again, as the manifestation of like my individual choices in life.
I think it's also if people just looked at this as if these were my kids. I often find it fascinating how we look at young people who are incarcerated and they're somehow supposedly different than the kids that we have at home. And if we just approach the system as what would I want for my own children, this would be a completely different conversation. It goes back to what I often talk about, this idea of otherizing. Like it's somehow us over here and our stuff and how we should be treated, and then them over there and what they deserve. Kurt, did you want to add anything onto that?
I agree with what Adam said. I told you I wasn't that smart, right? I just, no, but honestly, I do wholeheartedly agree with what he said, because unfortunately, when I was incarcerated, I didn't come out better. I just came out bigger and stronger, right? With no help in between. And if we don't start addressing that, like, and we also talk about recidivism a lot, right? But I was just with an individual who was incarcerated as a juvenile at the age of 16, who did 30 years. So we have a lot of mathematicians in here maybe, so you know how old he is now. But just getting him to go to the store by himself, right? He was actually scared, right? Because he said, I've been isolated for so long that I don't know how to engage with other people, right? And for him to see a cell phone, right, and be like, damn, what is that, right? And so him be so far behind the 8 ball, even with the computer age and technology, right? And so now we're throwing him right back into society and expect him to do well. And we expect him to be a productive citizen in our society, and we haven't prepared him yet for that. And we wonder why recidivism is so high. And back to what everyone has said, right? We really have to address all of those issues that cause people to be violent, right? We know that behavior is learned, right? I don't believe that no one, unless you have a mental illness, comes out of the womb violent, right? So again, to what everyone has said, right, why aren't people as violent in these other communities, right? When you just take a look at Chicago itself, right, 75% of the violence that's committed, right, comes from 7 communities, right? In those 7 communities, from the age of 16 to 24, we have the highest rate of unemployment for those youth and the highest dropout rate, not only in the city and the state, but in the country. So until we start addressing those issues, then we're going to keep on having these panels and discussions.
Can you just say that again? Like, y'all hear that? Like, in the 7 neighborhoods where there's the most amount of violence, there's also the highest rate of
Unemployment,
and the
highest dropout rate.
so like I know that we're not yet doctors in here and scientists, but like that to me is a good place to start. That is so profoundly simple, and yet like nobody's figured it out and been like, yo, if we just put some money in these 2 things, like let's just see what happens.
Thoughts?
I would just add brain development, more education on brain development in the conversation, the reaction versus response mechanism in the brain not being fully developed till 26 or 27. So we're making decisions within the juvenile system. Washington State, thanks for passing that on. I was traveling just for no more in Washington State can anybody, juvenile life has been abolished along with the death penalty this last week, which is great because they're taking a look at brain development. Now, as adults, we might, that study this, we're gonna know that. I think it's critically important to tell youth that we work with as well what's going on in their brain before they react in whatever situation it is, and all of a sudden you might have somebody that was nonviolent end up creating a violent act and now has that stigma put on them, not realizing, not an excuse, but not everything's, they don't count to 10 before they act, before they take action. So explaining that to them, we've done a lot of work in the juvenile detention facility. Sadly, we have like 11 kids right now in King County in Seattle sitting under the age of 18 going to get tried as adults. So the conversation with them about like what happened, what was missing, what wasn't there. And the other thing that I found really fascinating is nobody had asked them what happened. Not what happened that night when you did this, but what even happened that led you here. What can we unfortunately learn from your situation? What would you tell somebody that's coming up behind you that you know is doing the same thing that you were doing in order to make change? And what I find fascinating as an adult, because sometimes we don't get out of our own way, is the kids that are in there, they don't want to see their brothers and sisters in there. They want to be able to figure out how they can make change selflessly from what they've learned. So I think that that's important, that that message gets out and that they, again, get brought to the table in some of this conversation. But educating them on what's going on in their lives and their brain is critically important, I think, across the board, not just people that are in the juvenile justice system or in prisons.
I think it's shifting the conversation from like what's wrong with you to what has happened to you. And I think if we think about our own children, like that's the question we would ask, like what's happened to you? And then what do we need to do to help heal, to help make you whole? And that's the question that needs to be at the forefront of this entire issue, whether we're talking about mental health or we're talking about like it's not just what's happened to you as an individual, it's like the ecosystem in which you literally exist in is dysfunctional, and that it has effects.
Yeah, I was going to build on this also, sort of linking this to how we think about our own kids. Like I have a 14-year-old daughter, and I remember a couple of years ago saying, you can be president. We are going to have a female president 1 week from now. It didn't work out quite as we had expected, but a big part of what we try and do with our kids is help them expand their imaginations and think what's possible. And everything that happens to kids inside the juvenile justice system, in some sense, is shrinking their imagination.
Yeah.
It's like, there you are in the juvenile detention center, you look at the facility, you see exactly what the world thinks of you. You know that, these kids are smart. They know that 2/3 of the kids leaving detention are going to come back within 18 months. It's very hard not to sit there and think, this is the treadmill that I am now on, right? And so one of the things that we realized spending a bunch of time in the facility talking to the kids and talking to the staff, who then were starting to talk to the kids in the afternoon instead of having them watch TV, is the kids would say things like, as they're talking to the staff would say things like, I grew up in Englewood, and you know, I screwed up when I was in high school, I got taken in for this thing, I turned it around, and now here I am as I've got a middle-class job, I've got a house, I've got 3 kids, and you would hear the kids say, holy shit, Mr. P, you screwed up in high school. And like, that is a incredibly profound moment for a kid to realize. It's like, this is not the only trajectory that I have in front of me. Like, there is a whole other life that is possible. And the reason that I wanted to mention that in particular to this group is, like, you can think of part of what the staff is doing with kids is a form of mentoring. And, you know, one of the big challenges that we have in trying to improve life outcomes for kids is scaling up mentoring because we don't have enough mentors. That's a persistent challenge for big brothers, big sisters, for every sort of mentoring program. The good news is that there's lots of research showing us that peer-to-peer mentoring is as effective as having an adult mentor a kid, maybe even more effective. And so if you're thinking, like, what can I do tomorrow to be helpful? That's one, in addition to writing letters, making calls, voting on all of the big things that we're talking about on the panel. Like, that is a seemingly small thing to you that I think can seem like a gigantic thing to someone who's sitting inside a juvenile detention center on the west side of Chicago.
I also think that, piggybacking on the mentoring thing, that the number one answer to the if question out of the 3,000 answers that we have is no positive adult role model in their lives. And that's not just juveniles, sometimes that's adults. I mean, I'm assuming everybody in here probably has a mentor. And I think it's also important that people that have been impacted by the system are allowed to be mentors, are allowed to work with these kids, that it's not like you've got a record, you can't come help the person that's on their way to getting a record or is, you know, first or second time. I think there's really a lot of value in that story, you know, and like you talked about, Jens, turning things around. Somebody from the neighborhood that's actually changed their life. And how do you get that story out there? Because I could be wrong, but if you've changed your life and you left the neighborhood, are you coming back and saying, hey, I got out, you can get out, instead of saying, I don't have to go back there anymore, I don't have to do anything. And I just want to say something really quick, Curtis. You're probably the most educated person in this room to talk about what is going on because you have been impacted and you have that story. So I'm going to hope you're going to change the narrative, because education isn't always about letters after or in front of your name. It's about life lived.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
You know, it's so frustrating, and I'm sure that Curtis might share this frustration. And the hearing about mentorship, like, the people who can mentor us out of this situation are sitting in prison because they did something in the flash of a moment when they were children. And I get to be around them all the time, and I get so frustrated because I'm like, oh, all of the young people who come in here as new people, like all the 17 and 18-year-olds who are in here causing all the problems and driving all the they flock towards you, and you can talk them out of that. Like, I try to do that every day. I have 2 degrees, and you know, like, I'm a smart person, but they come seek out you. The fact that we are spending as much money as we are, holding the resources away from the rest of us that are going to fix our problem because we're mad at them, is stupid. I would like to ask, how many of you are, like, thinking about going into the system in some way or another? Wow.
When you say going in the system, he doesn't
Like,
mean getting
yeah.
arrested.
I don't mean like
I don't
mean
need to
going
get my quota up
going
for
to
this
prison.
month.
Sorry, I meant.
Did you see their eyeballs? They were like this.
I want to get locked up today.
This is
Right,
definitely
right,
an
right.
interactive group here. Just
Cool. How many of you are thinking about taking jobs and or projects or commitments that have to do with the juvenile justice system? Okay, much better.
Okay, look, that looks better. That looks a lot better.
Here's something that I don't want to leave out of this conversation. In all of our sort of systems inside of the criminal justice system, certainly juvenile court and juvenile prosecution and working with juveniles as police officers is looked at as, like, the least important thing that we do. Like, I went from our gang unit to our juvenile unit, and people are like, why are you lazy? Like, are you being demoted? What's wrong with you? And it's fascinating to me because the reason I left the gang unit to go to the juvenile unit was why? Why do you think that was?
You wanted to prevent him from joining again.
Everybody that I was working with in the gang unit had been through juvenile court like 5 times. And I'm like, why are we wasting our time? And so, like, if here's just another ask for you. If you are thinking about, like, coming into the system, make sure that people know that, like, mass incarceration is driven by our failure to address young people's problems full stop. We don't have this ballooning prison population that we do if we are taking young people when they first present with problems, and honestly that's more often or not in a school setting, but certainly like when they're coming to our courthouse, the reason that they continue to come back at 2/3, like at 70% recidivism rate is because we're not getting it right the first time. And so please advocate that like, if you're gonna go be a cop, learn about this stuff. If you're gonna be a prosecutor, learn about this stuff. If you're gonna be a teacher, learn about this stuff, because we can solve this problem.
I would add diversion. If you don't have diversion, meaning they don't have to go into the system and actually spend the night and end up in that room that it's hard to think out of really quickly too. I think somebody's talking about jobs. If you go into some neighborhoods, lower socioeconomic status, the jobs they think about are the police officer, the social worker, the teacher. They aren't thinking about necessarily attorney, lawyer, doctor, because that's not what's going on in the neighborhood. So thinking bigger than the neighborhood that they're from, giving people opportunity to think bigger out of the confinement that some people live in because of poverty and race, unfortunately, and having honest conversations about racism in this country that are a huge issue in this entire incarceration, whether it's juvenile or adult, and we don't have those honest issues. And the one little plug I will say is anybody that wants to do this work to understand where race falls into it and how we've gone from slavery to mass incarceration needs to watch 13. It's on Netflix, 100 Minutes of Your Life. Anybody in here watched it? Thank you. Hopefully, if you haven't, you want to look cool next time I ask, make sure you go watch it. 100 Minutes of Your Life tonight.
Let's go ahead and open it up for Q&A. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. So Mark's got the microphone back there.
And if you're up there, just shout.
Yeah.
Liz, do you want to point to people? We've got 2 volunteers with mics too.
Sure. Can you just throw your hand up? Let's just go right here to the lady in red, right on up front. Oh, great.
Great.
Or you're not asking a question? Okay. Hi, my name is Grace. I go to Georgetown University, and I'm actually taking a class right now in which we're talking about the impacts of incarceration and how it's changed. But 2 things I'd love for you to talk about that didn't come up is one, how a lot of the time when people are focusing on reforming the criminal justice system, how it actually leads to expansion. So if they're saying they're not addressing mental health and they're like, well, then we'll build a mental health ward and everyone will be happy, but then more money's going into the prison system. So that's one thing. And then second, if you could talk a bit about decriminalization, for example, like the 3 strikes rule and everything, and how decriminalizing could impact the mass number of people going into jail for these petty crimes.
Sure. So on the first tip, like, if you think about the institutions, particularly with people of color, the institutions that we've broken down, there's always one there to like scoop up the problem and make it worse. So like, ended slavery, great, Jim Crow. Ended Jim Crow, sort of, great, war on drugs. Ended war on drugs, sort of, great, mass incarceration. Like I've heard people say like, I don't actually want mass incarceration to end because I'm afraid of what the other side looks like. And we already see it happening where like people who 10 years ago were like, yes, mass incarceration is great, are like, no, actually, you know what? We don't feel that way anymore, but we're gonna supply you with ways to monitor young people in the community with ankle bracelets. Mm-hmm. And so there's like an economy here. Again, racism is a thing. Like, we need folks who are in this room to think about like, how do we have both and frankly, again, it's just like, it's an equity issue. It's just like, nobody was talking about college as a way to survive in my community. The neighborhood that I live in now, like when you talk to a black kid about college, it's like, do you wanna live? Then you should go to college. Like, let's just look at how we have these conversations in different places, because like, real talk, a lot of this stuff is happening in those other communities. We just don't wanna call the police about it. Mm-hmm. And so there's a whole other conversation to have there. With decriminalization, it's like if we think that we're gonna legislate and policy our way out of this, we're sadly mistaken. One is like leadership changes all the time and it's just a piece of paper with words on it. We really need to change the culture of people who are coming into these systems. And so like, there are laws on the books that say as a prosecutor, I was supposed to like prosecute people for cheating on their spouses and for spitting on the sidewalk and for not cleaning up their dog. I should have prosecuted the people that were not cleaning up their dog shit, but like, there are laws in the books that have existed for eons that don't get used because they're stupid. And so like I don't really care about decriminalization, except that it takes away the power of people who are bad actors. I'd rather just have good actors in there and just be like, these laws are stupid. I was caught selling weed as a kid. When I became a prosecutor, I was like, it would be pretty jacked off of me to prosecute people for selling weed, so I'm just not gonna do it. And as an individual and as a unit and then as an office, we just decided not to do that. The law didn't change, but that's where we were. So I'm happy that people are focused on advocacy to change policy and legislation. I don't think it's gonna be as effective as making the prosecutor's office and the governor's office and the mayor's office look more like this room than what they do now.
Let's go right here, gentleman in blue.
Hi. You just talked about seeing, I guess, the state of incarceration in the criminal justice system transforming. So I'm from UC Berkeley, and Michelle Alexander was actually at a session there, and she talked about seeing a new, like, digital state of, like, the criminal justice system. And so I just wanted to ask each of you about your thoughts on that. I guess, like, what are you seeing in forms of, like, how the state is transforming and using technology more? And I don't know if you are aware of some of the issues regarding technology and incarceration, but, like, judges using machine learning to predict how likely you are to recidivate and kind of other bad uses of technology in the state. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
What do you think are the problems with technology? Like, I have a risk assessment tool that's supposed to be determining whether or not somebody's going to reoffend. What questions do you think they're asking?
Sorry, questions that the people who are using it that are asking?
Yeah, so like the risk assessment tool is basically like a checklist of questions. And based off the answers to those questions, it's like there's an algorithm that figures out your risk to reoffend or your risk to not come back. What do you think some of those questions are that are being put into those risk assessment tools?
Man, I guess like, yeah, so like prior offenses, I guess like what are your background, like where you
Prior
coming
what?
from? Offenses.
Prior offenses, okay.
Mm-hmm.
What does that assume?
Like, yeah, that you have a previous criminal history, that you are a criminal, that you are coming from, I guess like a common like background or state.
And so what is the maybe unintended consequence of that?
Yeah, you're just gonna be biased, basically. The information that you're using, you're being biased, and that's one of the problems in, I guess, forming these algorithms. And commonly in machine learning, you're using a big set of data and information, and a lot of information is already biased, and so there's no measures to kind of like de-incorporate some of those biases that exist.
Can I add something? This actually feels like one of those issues that is deeply complicated from my perspective, because, you know, so you get arrested, the Constitution says you have to go in front of a judge within 24, 48 hours who's gonna make a decision about where you wait trial. You're gonna go home, you're gonna sit in jail. In every state, the law says that the judge is supposed to make that decision based on a prediction, right? And then how does the judge do that right now? The judge gets a manila folder with your prior criminal record, and then the judge does what? Who the hell knows, right? So, like, we've been doing a bunch of work with data in New York City. 80% of the people arrested in New York City are black or brown. 80% of the population of New York City is not black or brown. And then the judges take a caseload that is 80% African American or Hispanic and create a jail population that is 90% African American or Hispanic. So you look at the jail in New York City and you think, how did we get there? It wasn't through algorithms. It was through a bunch of human beings, police officers, prosecutors, judges, doing who the hell knows what in their heads. In a world in which we have a huge amount of behavioral science research that tells us that in-group, out-group thinking is one of the most primitive, basic things that all human brains do, a lot of it implicit. We don't even know that we're doing it. And so, like, everything that you say about like concern with the data is exactly right. Everything that you say about the ways in which algorithms can be misused is exactly right. But it's like the law says that a prediction has to be made. So the choice is not no prediction, no use of data. The choice is the human brain or the algorithm. And I think what is better, or let's say less bad,
Yes.
between those two choices, I think it's not self-evident to me, at least.
I want to add something to that too. Within all the research and the data and stuff, the other thing that's not happening that is women's incarceration. Women are getting arrested at a higher rate than men right now. And you do need to separate the genders out if you're going to use that type of technology, because the criminogenic factors that lead to incarceration for men are previous criminal behavior, previous criminal record, antisocial behavior, antisocial environment, antisocial friends. That's been called the big four. The female four are chemical dependency, unhealthy relationships, and UNLV's about ready to add anxious depressive disorder and economic marginality. So when you're taking a look at this whole issue too, you have to separate the genders out, women and men, and what's needed, and boys and girls in the juvenile justice system. The boys need very different things than the girls actually need, and they're very different things that lead them to incarceration. 80% of women that are incarcerated are mothers, which means if we don't figure out the girl and the woman thing, we've got the next generation of incarceration coming up from behind them. So if you are going to do a risk need assessment or something like that, you have to separate the genders out in doing that.
Let's go all the way up top.
Shout it out.
Yep, nice and loud.
My name is Destiny Williamson, and I go to this school, University of Chicago Laboratory School. And my question is, when it comes to maximum security facilities such as Statesville and Menard, do you feel that the majority of the officers, which are white, when it comes to regular officers in general, do you feel that that also has a lot to do with the mass incarceration of young Black people?
It also has a lot to do to where these facilities are placed, right? And it creates this new ecosystem as well as an economic system for those people and those individuals who live in those communities. So yeah, I mean, that's really something to think about. Like when you think about Statesville and Menard, and also an institution called TAMS, and I'm so glad that it was closed down. I mean, again, right back to what Adam said, right? Just the dehumanization of the whole thing, man. Like most of those institutions, right, you gotta understand that they're on 23 and 1, which means that you're incarcerated or locked up in a cell by yourself for 23 hours with 1 hour to shower, and with 30 minutes to maybe shower and another 30 minutes for what they consider rec. In TAMS, we had to create our own sign language that we used to do and knock on walls just to have interaction with each other. And I know so many young men that have came out mentally unstable just from the dehumanization of that type of thing. So I totally agree with what you're saying.
It's right here, sir.
Go ahead, bro.
You can just stand up and speak loud.
Hi, I'm Evan Malvin from Georgia State University. So a lot of times when we talk about these issues from a very large social standpoint, so especially for trying to go through the system and change things as well as change people's mind, what advice would you give on talking about the economic issues? Just like the fact of the matter is how in both juvenile and adult incarceration, there's a lot of industries that are based completely on that, including hiring guards, as well as the manufacturing of all the items that go into a prison. So how would you advise somebody who's trying to combat that?
Yeah, he's talking about the prison industrial complex. I know he's yeah.
I love this question, and this is actually sort of like my critique of the 13th, is that I think that we oversell the power of corporate greed to run our system. Because our system, private prisons are at the back end of the decisions of lots of other people. And those other people, whether they're the cops, whether they're prosecutors, whether they're probation officers, we're not in these jobs for the money. The prisons, despite whatever myths you've heard, or maybe there's one-off stories of this actually happening, prosecutors' checks aren't growing because we are sending more people to prison. There's some nuance in there because metrics that we have in the offices that we work at that are hey, you're a good prosecutor because you tried a lot of cases and you convicted a lot of people and you sent them to prison. But that to me is not, it's not like an economic motive that like gets me to go harder. That's actually just about like, I'm a person who like needs validation in this place, and therefore like this is the only way that I can get validation. But that is where I see opportunity, because it's just like, all right, you just need better metrics. Like a good prosecutor to me, if I'm thinking about safety, is how do I make sure that people are getting the things that make them safer in their lives? So when I took over the juvenile unit in our office, I didn't like trials, I didn't care. I don't need you doing trials. I need you to find out where these young people are in housing, employment, education, access to healthcare, and access to pro-social activity. Those are our 5. And if you can increase the number of hours, literally the number of hours that those young people are engaging in those things, or you're increasing the stability of their housing, now you're getting promoted. Because, not because we're like touchy-feely out there in Boston, but because that leads to better outcomes for young people and the better outcomes for all of us. And so like, yes, there is an economy that exists because of the criminal justice system. The people who enjoy that part of the economy are the same 1% that don't come to these things. The people who drive the entire system, the people part of the system, aren't out here trying to rack up convictions and arrests because we're getting paid. It's because we don't have better metrics for our success.
Makes sense.
I think we have time for one more question. Sir?
You mentioned about prosecution. Oh, thank you. Sorry, you mentioned about prosecution. Do you feel that, say, children of a certain zip code or children of a certain color are over-prosecuted compared to, say, children in, say, Lakeview, where a prosecutor looks at a child and say, oh, I might ruin this person's life. But then they look at another child from another zip code and color and say, oh, this is just how it is. I'll put them in prison, they get on the cycle, and that's just how it goes. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't feel anything about it. It's just like, that's just a fact. Like feelings aren't facts, that is a fact. And what is wild about it, and I'm glad that we're speaking to the people that we are in this room, like, I know that all y'all saw like thousands of crimes while you're in college, and like the police didn't show up. Like the police, maybe they came around and maybe like arrested people, separated them, but like, I went to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Like, they called it the zoo for a reason. And like, but before I ever became a prosecutor, I saw tens of thousands of crimes committed, physical fights, sexual violence, the sale and intake of drugs, the provision of liquor, the piracy of music and intellectual property, all of these things happening over and over and over again. And there was no like intervention by police. Like maybe you got to write up from your dorm, maybe you had to transfer dorms, but it was because as a society, we actually recognize that like 18 to 25 is the sweet spot. And that's where we're biologically engineered to take risks and do dumb things. As a society, we've said, if you're in these places because you are privileged, we're gonna let that happen because we know that one, you'll desist from it, like you will stop doing it at some point in time. And that is particularly true if we give you this thing at the end of the line, a degree, and you go out and get a job. We know that you're not gonna be a dangerous person if we let you screw up in here and that happens. But because of our culture and the way that we've been conditioned to look at people from other places, we don't give them that same path. We fear what that behavior means, and we don't provide them a space to do that same normative adolescent growing up and screwing up. And we talk in terms of chances. The question I get all the time is like, what happens when you give somebody a second chance and they burn you in the DA's office? And I'm like, how many chances did you get? Like we lose our way in the othering you talked about earlier, and to say like somehow this group of people is not afforded the same number of chances that this group of people. And like to me, that's again part of the culture is we need to say those things out loud in law school. We need to say those things out loud in college. I didn't learn anything about racial disparity in law school before I went out and became a prosecutor in an office where 90% of the people coming through the courthouse were black and brown, and 2% of the prosecutors were of color. That is where the problem begins for me.
I also want to add in acknowledging privilege and what that means, and I do think there's a responsibility, if you have it, to ask these questions. And I would guarantee you everybody in this room has broken the law at one point in their life. Nods? Everybody's at least broke the speed limit, right? Obviously you're not incarcerated because you're here. So everybody has broken the law. 1 in 3 people in our country have a record. That's a problem. So, you know, I think calling the thing out that Adam talked about, these are conversations at your age that you should start having in all of your social circles to start educating other people about what's really going on in this country that can even start to address the juvenile justice system, which then leads to the adult system.
And with that, we're going to end. Let's give our panel a warm round of applause.